is Brandy Buliga, and I'm the Technical Assistance and Training Specialist here at Violence Free Colorado. And this month, our great webinar for Brown Bag is Understanding the Dynamics and Context of Substance Use for Survivors of Domestic Violence and Sexual Assault. We have Gabriela Zapata-Alma. She is with the National Center on Domestic Violence, Trauma, and Mental Health, as well as on the faculty of the University of Chicago. And I'm going to have Gabriela do more of an introduction, but feel free to let us know if during the webinar, if you have any questions, you can type them into the chat box. You can also know that at the end of the webinar, we're going to save some time for questions. So feel free to ask them during or at the end, or both. And if you have any questions, you should be able to unmute yourself as well. But if you're having problems with that, please let me know in the chat box. Other than that, I'm going to turn it over to Gabriela.
Hi, thanks so much, everyone. I'll actually turn on my video for a second and just give a video. Hey, what's up? How y'all doing? Okay, now I'm going to turn off my video so I don't have to look at myself as I'm talking. So I hope everybody is doing well. I know that this is really, unprecedented times. And I feel like a month ago, the kind of word of the year was abundance of caution, and now the word of the year is unprecedented times. So I just hope that everyone is safe, is healthy, all of you and your families and loved ones. And I'm glad to share this information. And I hope that it's going to be more of a conversation, that I know that 60 minutes certainly isn't enough time to exhaust this topic. And so anything that we can do to just have a conversation and any questions I can answer along the way, please feel free. And I am going to try to go through some of these slides a little more quickly, just so we have more time at the end.
Great. And as we're going to jump in, one of the things that we wanted to ask all of you who are in attendance, again, we are recording the webinar, but as we mentioned, the Q&A is going to be mostly at the end. And so we have a poll question. Is that something that all of you can see, I hope? Let's see. So the poll question is, would you feel more comfortable asking specific questions if the recording ends prior to the Q&A starting? So we just want to be thoughtful about if folks feel they would be more candid and ask more specific questions if the recording was not happening, because we can oblige. But I just want to actually, here we go. There we go. Now you can probably see that. So we want to ask all the attendees to take a second and vote. Whether you want us to stop that or whether you want us to record the Q&A as well. And we do send out the link to the recording that'll be on YouTube, as well as the materials that Gabriela is presenting on. All right, looks like we have 21 people who have voted, and everybody is voting to record the Q&A so far. We don't have anybody asking to stop recording before the Q&A. So that looks like the majority of people have voted. So I'm going to go ahead and end the polling now, and we'll keep the recording going. If for some reason something comes up or someone has a question that they don't feel comfortable asking online, it's okay to reach out, and we'll come up with a way to make sure that you can ask that question.
Great. Thanks, everyone.
Great.
Just a little bit about our center. We are funded through the Administration for Children and Families, and we're the Special Issue Resource Center dedicated to addressing the intersection of domestic violence, trauma, substance use, and mental health. So we do TTA, and we have a bunch of resources and services available through our website. We conduct research and evaluation. We also conduct policy development and analysis, as well as help raise public awareness, and we're happy to be a resource. And then this is my disclaimer. The things I say represent myself and not necessarily our government funders. So first, starting out with our integrated framework. And so everything that we do is really rooted in survivor-defined approaches that support physical and emotional safety, that foster hope and resilience, and that all of this is possible through relationship and connection. And that this really forms the basis for a trauma-informed approach, human rights and social justice-based approach that attends to cultural, historical, and community contexts, as well as the empowerment framework of DV and DVSA advocacy. So here are some topics. So really just looking at the relationship between domestic violence, sexual assault, trauma, mental health, and substance use, including substance use coercion, and then introducing ideas for how we can support survivors within an accessible, culturally responsive, and trauma-informed approach. And so first looking at what is the connection between all of these. And folks, feel free to enter in the chat box things that you feel are the links and connections between sexual assault, domestic violence, mental health, substance use, and trauma. And so I'll provide some facts and figures here. So intimate partner violence has significant mental health and substance use effects. So research over the past 35 years has shown that being victimized by an intimate partner can increase a person's risk for depression, PTSD, eating disorders, insomnia, substance use, and suicidality, as well as a whole range of chronic physical health conditions, including chronic pain. And here we see just some of the rates of increased risk. So for substance use disorders, it's 6 times higher risk of developing a substance use disorder. And we'll talk more about why. Also looking specifically at experiences of victimization for women, it's been found that substance use disorders are over 4 times higher in women who have a history of victimization. And so here we see a true vicious cycle where a prior assault is a risk factor for developing a substance use disorder, and then that substance use disorder turns into a risk factor for ongoing targeting and victimization. And then we also see that trauma across the lifespan and adverse childhood experiences also have an impact of increasing risks. Both increasing risks for domestic violence, as well as physical health risks, mental health risks. So for example, so for folks who aren't familiar with the adverse childhood experiences, there are 10 adverse childhood experiences that have been studied at length. And so for every one that a person has experienced under the age of 18, that's correlated with a certain amount of risk for a different kinds of adverse outcomes. So for example, by the time that people have experienced 4 adverse childhood experiences, so 4 different types of adverse childhood experiences, that is correlated with a 13 times higher rate of suicide attempts. When thinking about substance use, 4 adverse childhood experiences is associated with a 7 times higher rate of alcohol use disorder and a 10 times higher rate of intravenous drug use. And then specifically for people assigned the male sex at birth, 6 adverse childhood experiences was correlated with a 46 times higher rate of intravenous drug use. So of course, none of this isn't fate. This is risk levels and increasing risk levels. This doesn't tell us anything about protective factors or resilience. So not taking this as kind of de facto, but looking at the relationship between trauma and all of these different kind of both social adversities as well as health adversities. Oh, and let me also state for folks that aren't familiar with this already, that adverse childhood experiences are things such as, being exposed to domestic violence as a child, experiencing physical abuse, sexual abuse, emotional abuse, or neglect, or physical neglect, things like that. So in addition to the increased risks to health that's associated with intimate partner violence and sexual assault, abuse also often targets a person's, directly targets their health and their access to healthcare services. So in a pattern of abuse known as mental health coercion, we actually conducted a survey style study with the National Domestic Violence Hotline. And so people who called the hotline and were not in crisis were asked if they wanted to participate in a short, like 5-question survey. And so the people who participated were not screened for mental health or substance use. This was just general callers who were not in crisis and consented to participate in the survey. And so of those callers, the vast majority, 4 out of 5, said their partner accused them of being, quote, crazy. And this included trying to diagnose them or tell them that they had different kinds of mental health diagnoses that they found particularly distressful. 3 and 4 said that their partner deliberately did things to make them feel like they were losing their mind, so gaslighting. And then 1 and 2 said that their partner threatened to report that they were, quote, crazy to keep them from getting something that they needed or wanted, such as a protection order or custody of their children. So really seeing how mental health is attacked as part of the tactic of abuse. In addition to mental health coercion, we also found really high rates of substance use coercion. And so here, finding that 26% had used substances to try to deal with the pain of domestic violence, that 27% had been pressured or forced to use substances or made to use more than they wanted, that 24% were afraid to call the police because their partner said that they'd be arrested or not believed because they were using substances. And then 38% said that their partner had threatened to report their substance use to authorities to prevent them from getting something they wanted or needed. And so here, I also had the opportunity to participate in some key informant interviews where we interviewed people with lived experience of substance use coercion, as well as different service providers, both advocates and substance use treatment and human trafficking service providers. And what we heard time and time again was that this is really common, and that it goes underreported. What we also heard time and time again is that when people try to get help, they end up really locked out of the different systems that are meant to help them. So they kind of end up ping-ponging between providers who say, oh, we don't know about that. You have to go to these people. They're the specialists. So they get ping-ponged between substance use providers and human trafficking providers and DV providers because everyone is telling them, well, your problems are too complex or we don't know how to deal with that, right? And that what the abusive partner had told them in terms of, saying just really, really, of course, terrible things meant to denigrate them, but also telling them that no one would help them, that no one would believe them, that when we talked with survivors, a lot of them reported a lot of them shared with us that was their experience, that it was like an abusive partner got them hooked on drugs, kept feeding them more drugs or forcing them to use or using the drugs as a way to kind of trap them in the relationship, and then would tell them no one's going to help you because you're a drug addict. And then when they would try to get help, that's what they would find out is that a lot of times they get turned away because they did have a substance use history. So it's almost like proving the abusive partner right in a lot of ways. So we've also found that many survivors are introduced to substances by an intimate partner, and that intimate partners play a really large role in both the initiation of substance use as well as moving from, just kind of starting or sampling substances to escalating that to substance use problems. So where we start seeing the physiological dependence or the kind of like the behaviors that come along with substance use that can lead to a lot of the adverse consequences. In addition to that, substances we found time and time again were critical in trapping survivors in abusive relationships. so that they are commonly used by abusive partners to draw survivors back into the relationship or keep them in abusive relationships. And this shows up in a lot of different tactics of abuse. For example, supplying survivors with substances as a way to, quote, apologize for abuse and violence. Something to note here is that when people use substances, there are a lot of different things that get associated with their substance use that then act as, quote, triggers to use. So, for example, I'll use actually a really benign example. I used to smoke cigarettes, and I used to provide home-based services. I used to do home visiting. And so when I would be driving in the community, kind of between home to home, it'd be really common where I would just smoke a cigarette, driving from one home to the other. And so when I quit smoking tobacco, a trigger for me was getting in the car and driving, because it reminded me of when I would smoke that cigarette and the feeling I would get of whatever I associated with that, whether it was stress reduction or, whatever I kind of associated with that positive experience of the substance use. And so we have this neurochemistry that gets activated by things associated with use. And so, and I'll say that neurochemistry is actually much stronger in women, that our neurochemistry predisposes women to having more intense cravings, which then results in higher rates of relapse to substance use after a period of recovery. And so whether consciously or unconsciously, this kind of relapse neurocircuitry can get triggered by abusive partners who then start, showing up and showing us things that remind us of substance use. And then that becomes a way to then kind of suck the person back into the relationship. Another way this shows up is controlling survivors' access to substances as a way to keep them in the relationship. So this is really common, particularly when someone has developed a physiological dependence to a substance, so meaning that they go through some withdrawal if they stop using. And withdrawal from some substances can be very, very intensely uncomfortable and painful. Things that, we wouldn't wish on our worst enemy. And can be life-threatening for some substances, including alcohol and benzodiazepines, which are medications used to treat anxiety, such as Xanax and Valium and medications like that. So withdrawal can be actually fatal, potentially. And so what we've heard time and time again is, an abusive partner getting somebody physiologically dependent on a substance and then using that to control them. And we heard from several survivors that when they were trying to leave their partner, they weren't able to get substances from anyone else in the community because they had been kind of like marked as belonging to the abusive partner. And so the only way for them to get substances was to continue to go back to the abusive partner. And that this becomes especially dangerous and difficult when people aren't able to access any kind of treatment to deal with the withdrawal. So, and that this also became a way to force people into an illegal activity. That then people were forced to into sexual trafficking, into selling drugs, into engaging in illegal activity, engaging in illegal activity in order to get more drugs, etc. And then, of course, the threatening to report survivor substance use to law enforcement or child protective services as a mechanism of control. I remember talking with one survivor who shared with me that she had been forced to sell drugs for the abusive partner and then had been arrested and had a court case because of it, and then was entrapped at home and not allowed to attend the court case. And then, of course, had a warrant out for her arrest because she failed to show up to court. And then the abusive partner would just threaten with calling the police on her because of her outstanding warrant as a way to control her. And so she shared that that she actually ended up it took her several years to escape this abusive relationship, and that because of the substance use coercion, that it took her several more years than if substance use coercion wouldn't have been part of the picture. And she also shared that she hadn't been able to access any DV services or substance use treatment services, and that it was actually through harm reduction services that she was able to get the help and support that she needed. She said, "My harm reduction family saved my life." And then forcing survivors into withdrawal as a way to harm and control them, or threatening them with withdrawal. So that's something else to keep in mind, that a lot of people may try to go through withdrawal on their own, or they may try to get services on their own, and that we can be really helpful in helping folks to do, if they are looking to withdraw from substances, to help them find safe ways to do that and healthy ways to do that, and ways that are aligned with their own choices and what they define as their needs. But that we never would want to put someone in a situation where they feel like their withdrawal is being chosen for them or forced on them. Not only because it can be very physically dangerous for people with certain substances, like I mentioned, alcohol and benzodiazepines primarily, but also because this can really replicate the dynamics that an abusive partner has used to exert control over them. And so in that way, it can be really re-traumatizing. So in addition to all the abusive tactics that are targeting a survivor's health, including their mental health and substance use health, we also found that abusive partners were targeting people's access to health care. And so from that same study, we found that 1 in 2 of the callers who had tried to get some kind of mental health services, that their partner had prevented them, discouraged them, or used that as another way to attack them. And that on the other side, for those who had tried to access any kind of substance use treatment service, that 60% of them had experienced their partner interfering with that or using that as a means to further abuse them. And so why is this so pervasive? Well, it's so pervasive because these forms of abuse can be incredibly effective in isolating people from sources of support. And why is that? It's because of stigma. So that stigma associated with substance use and mental illness contribute to the effectiveness of these abusive tactics and create additional barriers for survivors when they seek help. I remember talking with one survivor in the key informant interviews, and she was just saying, like, safety or sobriety, which one's first? And that leaving an abusive partner is so incredibly difficult, and that if you make services based on needing to quit substances at the same time, then it becomes virtually impossible. And then here is a visual of kind of the complexity of barriers and control tactics that survivors and their children face. And that while we certainly don't have control over an abuser's behavior, and people who use violence and control against their partners are accountable for their own behavior, what we do have some control over is the stigma and the system responses, and really helping to create more access within our services so that we can effectively offer support and resources to survivors who use substances. What we've found time and time again is that survivors who use substances are also experiencing substance use coercion in one way or another, usually in many, many, many different ways. So, what can it look like to practice ACRTI advocacy for survivors who use substances? And here you see an image from the Harm Reduction Coalition. And it's this woman holding up a card that says, "I challenge stigma by treating all people with dignity." And so sometimes when people invite me to speak, they think that I'm going to tell them how to get people off drugs. And I certainly have a lot of experience with that as being a former treatment provider, but that's not what I'm here to talk about today. What I'm here to talk about is how to create a nurturing and safe environment for folks, because everything in nature moves towards healing when we have a safe environment, when we have support, and when we have people, safe people, who care about us. And so really, it's, if we're focused on trying to get someone to change their behavior, then we've already kind of lost, because that's just more kind of control, and that just gets caught up in power and control stuff, which survivors, of course, are very, very aware of, because their very survival depends on them being very aware of this, of power and control dynamics. But when we approach this more as treating each person with dignity and approaching the problems of substance use like we would any other relationship that has risks within it. So interestingly, substance use actually is very relational. A lot of times people even talk about their substances as if they are relationships. A lot of times people use in order to address feelings of loneliness or isolation. And so rather than approaching it as substances are the problem or people who use substances have problems, we're really looking at, it's actually the dynamic between the person and the substances. It's the relationship where that's where there are different kinds of risks. And so this helps us to have a framework where we move beyond conversations about whether or not someone should go to treatment or whether or not they should change their substance use. And instead we focus on how can we safety plan? How can we grow our awareness of the different risks involved in substance use? And how can we effectively offer support and resources and strategies for someone to be able to mitigate some of the risks that come along with their substance use, if there are risks that come along with their substance use? And so this is very similar to really approaching safety planning for domestic violence. That if we approached a survivor as, when are you going to leave this person, right? That wouldn't be survivor defined, and that wouldn't be very helpful, would it? And so really looking at this as from the same kind of survivor defined framework as we would when we approach safety planning around domestic violence relationships or relationships that hold risks. So our values and intentions in this approach: to honor each person's wholeness, to provide culturally responsive support. So here, for example, when a lot of times in talking with folks, I'll talk about recovery, but recovery is actually quite a culturally specific term, and that there are a lot of folks who the word recovery or the concept of recovery doesn't actually hold a whole lot of meaning, and it feels very kind of irrelevant to them, for them. I've worked with some folks that the much more meaningful concept is the concept of healing. And then I've worked with other folks that the much more kind of culturally responsive concept for them is just getting healthy, right? So, so that it becomes so important to really focus on how does the person understand themselves and their own situation and what is meaningful for them. And that in this way, understanding that so many of the things that we may take for granted when it comes to even the language we use around substance use can be really culturally rooted and specific. Preserving dignity and choice. That healing and recovery are born out of our dignity and our choice, not being controlled. Using person-first language. So this looks like talking about someone, a person who uses substances versus a quote substance user, right? Avoiding re-traumatization. And so this takes an awareness of understanding all the different ways that re-traumatization can show up. being present and non-judgmental. And so this reminds me, for example, of talking with someone one time who shared, well, how can I provide services in this way without kind of condoning substance use or saying I give permission for someone to use substances? And as soon as we're kind of in that mindset of condoning or giving permission, we're already entering into judgments. And as it turns out, no one has ever needed my permission in order to use substances. If they did, that would make all of our lives much simpler, right? And so people already receive so much judgment everywhere they go around their substance use. Many times, the only place they don't get negatively judged for their substance use is with their substance using networks, which very often include an abusive partner or ex-partner. And so we want to be that non-judgmental space that has that radical trustworthiness and that radical presence with people. And that within that, we can remain connected and caring. And that a lot of this really relies on us doing our own self-work, because the times that we're more likely to slip into without even knowing it, right? Because we're all human and we're all doing the best we can. And we're all personally impacted by the work as well as our personal experiences and history. But a lot of the times what can get in the way of that being able to remain connected and remaining non-judgmental is our own experiences that get brought up for us with experiences with substance use, either experiences of people who we've loved who have struggled with different substance use related problems, or maybe our own recovery journey, or kind of our own ideas of who uses substances and who doesn't. And so being really aware of that and doing our own work, our own self-work, as well as having organizations where we can get support around being able to build awareness of our own responses and working through our responses, so our values are what guide our work rather than kind of reacting. Providing access to our services and supports. And that a lot of times, so something that I found really helpful when I was kind of newer in the field and would find myself just feeling like, oh, I've tried everything and nothing is working and I don't know what else I could possibly offer or try. Learning that was actually a really important sign that I needed to seek out some consultation and support. That I needed to talk to someone, whether it was a peer or a clinical supervisor or a colleague, but that I needed to talk to someone who could kind of look at the situation outside of my own perspective and help me think through some different perspectives and some different options of what I could try. And so that feeling like we've tried everything and there's just nothing left doesn't mean there's nothing left. It means it's time to reach out. And then the no wrong door approach. So that it's not a matter of, oh, well, we don't specialize in that, go talk to the specialist. No, that it's actually come in. And then if there's something that you need, that you say that you need, that you're interested in, that you feel like is important in your safety and in your goals, then we're going to help link you to that service. But that's done through bringing the person in to our supports and services, not by just gatekeeping. So all good intentions, right? But what gets in the way? So a lot of worrying about what if. So what if things escalate? What if things get out of hand? What if we try to help them and then something bad happens? Will we be held responsible? So a lot of what ifs get in the way. A lot of gaps in information, our own experiences, which I already said a little bit about in the last slide. Stigma, of course. Labeling, not knowing what would be helpful. So really just feeling kind of a big question mark or feeling at a loss. And then not being aware of crisis plans and policies or not being able to act on them. A lot of times when I talk with folks around kind of what gets in the way, it's a sense of, well, we're not set up to support people who are experiencing, this kind of crisis. And so something that we have to get real clear about is that just because someone uses substances does not mean that they will have a crisis or that they will be become escalated or any of these other things that we tend to kind of fear in the what ifs. And that regardless of whether or not someone uses substances in our program, we need to have really well developed crisis prevention and crisis management policies and practices. That de-escalation skills and supporting people with trauma-informed crisis support is important whether or not anyone ever uses substances in our programs. And so a lot of what we can think about is, well, what if this happens? It's like, okay, well, what would you do in that situation if that was happening and someone wasn't using substances? How would you respond, right? And that helps us work through some of that stigma around substance use. So thinking about language, labels, and diagnoses. So we have a couple resources on our website. One is Navigating Conversations About Psychiatric Diagnoses, and that can apply to substance use diagnoses as well. And then another one is Definitions and Language Related to Substance Use. And I'm happy to also share those and email those out through Brandy when the slides get sent out as well. So keeping in mind that there's a wide range of perspectives, ranging from that, labels and diagnoses are helpful or not helpful, and that there's a lot of different ways of describing our experiences. And at the same time, that if someone does experience a substance use disorder, then really taking the lens of disability justice. And what does that mean? Also, keeping in mind that knowing and sharing experiences can be helpful for a lot of people, but that stigma and discrimination are always harmful. And so also thinking about, there's a lot of assumptions that come into play when we think about substance use, that a lot of the signs of substance use intoxication, for example, map right onto signs of mental health conditions, physical health conditions, and as well as signs of traumatic brain injury and signs of somebody surviving strangulation. And so when there's so much space for assumptions to be made, and to really pay attention to who are the survivors that we're saying, oh no, they're using substances and we're turning away or we're turning away from, and who are the survivors that we're recognizing that this might be more related to a mental health concern or past strangulation or a physical health concern, and we're inviting them into our services. And that a lot of times, institutionalized racism can also get played out in these ways, that when it comes to racial bias, it will find any way to slip into our organizations unknowingly, that implicit racism and that implicit bias, and that substance use, discrimination based on substance use, very often maps right onto racial bias as well, and other kinds of isms. Something else to keep in mind here is that some of the language around substance use reflects specific views of substance use and people who use substances, and it's not all pretty. Some of the language indicates compassion fatigue, or can be really limiting, be really labeling of people. And so again, and also that there's a lot of language that has a lot of historical baggage. For example, the term marijuana is actually, that was a term that came into play as a way to try to demonize Mexican immigrants and label them all as people who use substances and try to strip away their rights. Before that kind of propaganda, it was just commonly spoken of as cannabis, not as marijuana. And so being aware that language has history, and so we always want to practice empowering, neutral, and person first language. And so bearing in mind that we tend to see things as we are rather than as they are. And then the range of experiences that, you know, a lot of times when we learn that someone is using substances, we're kind of focused on, well, what kind of treatment options could we offer, or what treatment would be helpful? And as a former treatment provider, I certainly think that sometimes people have a lot to gain from accessing treatment. But I can also say that mandated treatment is not the way to go, and that people heal and recover in all kinds of ways, and that it's not just through formal treatment. And that within expanding our perspective, understanding that substance use exists on a spectrum, that not all substance use is problematic or even meets criteria for a substance use disorder, and that there can be a lot of substance use that is casual, that is non-problematic, or potentially even has beneficial use. And so we want to get away from really labeling someone's substance use as problematic, and instead coming alongside and trying to understand, how do they view their substance use? What do they find that it helps them with? What do they find are maybe like the less helpful parts of it? How does it align or not align with their goals? And really taking that survivor-defined approach. And so all of this kind of rests on our understanding of resilience, that we have an inherent capacity to adapt to really serious threats and circumstances in a way that allows us to survive them. And so when we're thinking about substance use within the context of domestic violence and sexual assault, it's important that any problems related to substance use be really understood as survival tactics. So the same way that, you know, in post-traumatic stress disorder, there's part of the diagnosis is hypervigilance. So that is kind of like always kind of looking over your shoulder, never wanting to sit with your back towards the door, always like kind of being aware of your surroundings. Is someone threatening you? Is someone stalking you? Is someone coming after you? That's part of the PTSD diagnosis, but we also understand that for someone who's experiencing domestic violence and or sexual assault, that's actually a survival response that could be a really important part of them staying alive, right? And so in that same vein, substance use can be a really important part of someone's survival responses, helping them stay alive. And in all of the key informant interviews that I was a part of with survivors of substance use coercion, every single one of them, unprompted, these were individual conversations, every single one of them at one point or another said, there was a time that using substances saved my life. And there's a lot of different ways that can show up. That can show up as if they hadn't used substances, they would have been even more abused by a partner. That can also show up in that using the substances was what helped them cope at a point where they were dealing with suicidality. So my approach to substance use, in that I used both as a housing provider and as a formal treatment provider working with survivors, is I'm never here to take someone's drugs away. What I am here to do is offer support and resources and to support their goals and what they define as their needs, because many times the substance use problems, if there are problems, will naturally resolve as people have the support and resources they need in order to meet their own needs and heal and establish safety and stability. So in this framework, the power threat meaning framework, and they have like a 400-page manual online. So I'm just giving you a very short snippet of it. Rather than looking at diagnosis, they're looking at how can we understand mental health and substance use and trauma responses within the context of how power has interacted in our lives, what kinds of core threats to our safety that power has has visited upon us. So what's been the impact of that power in our lives? And then what meaning do we make of it? What do people tell us about it? What do we tell ourselves about it? And this is where that societal stigma and thinking about how survivors are dealing with the stigma of substance use, of domestic violence, of sexual assault, of potentially being a parent who uses substances, of potentially being a woman who uses substances, of housing instability, right? All of the multiple forms of stigma and discrimination that layer on top of each other. And then not to mention any kind of racial discrimination or ethnic discrimination or historical trauma. And then from there, understanding what's helping them to survive within the context of the power and the threat and the meaning and discourse. So I'll walk you through an example. And here are some core reflection questions to kind of think about as you're trying to understand someone's substance use as beyond just being a quote problem. I was providing some consultation for a housing program, and they were talking about a young woman who had received some emergency food vouchers. She was living in the transitional housing program, and she was a survivor of domestic violence and sexual assault, as well as childhood trauma, and had been homeless, had experienced homelessness. And they were providing her with emergency food vouchers, and this certain funder that they got the food vouchers from required copies of receipts to be kept unfiled. And so this young woman hadn't been able to offer a copy of the receipt and felt safe enough in that moment to say, I don't have a copy of the receipt because I traded it for drugs, right? She had to feel pretty safe in order to volunteer that information. And so the staff were struggling with what to do. There are some staff who are talking about, well, if she's trading it for drugs, then she can't qualify for food vouchers anymore. And luckily, I got to be part of the conversation and share, okay, like, let's slow down. Let's think about kind of what's coming up. First, to be clear, lack of food access does not produce recovery. Actually, when people don't have stable access to food, a lot of times that increases substance use and increases the riskiness of substance use. So let's just kind of put a pause button on that one. Then, what can we do to talk with her to try to understand what was coming up for her, that she felt like the best choice that she could make in that moment was to trade her food voucher, emergency food voucher for drugs. Let's have some empathy. Let's see her reality from her perspective. And so we talked through some different ways to kind of open up conversation, and they did have a strong foundation of a trusting relationship. So in going back and following up, they actually were able to talk about how she was, again, experiencing a domestic violence relationship. She was currently with a partner who was abusing her and was coercing her into sexual trafficking, and that the abuse would become much more lethal, frankly, when she wasn't able to provide money for drugs. And so for all we know, her being able to trade that food voucher that night for drugs could have saved her life. And so the important thing here is, that we know that survivors know what they need. We know that they know their relationships and they know what is safe and what is not safe for them. And we trust and believe survivors. And so it gets tricky when we're experiencing stigma related to substance use. It's easy to run into kind of snap decisions, and how important it is to build that foundation of that non-judgmental approach. I'm sorry. I hope you don't hear my son in the background. He is at my office door calling for me. Sorry if you do hear that in the background. And that the importance of being able to build the relationally safe environments where people can talk about what's really going on with them and their substance use, because it always plays a role with their safety from domestic violence and substance and sexual assault. And unless we can have unless we build the foundation to have these safe relationships, then there's a whole part of their lives that we are completely missing when it comes to safety planning. Thanks, everyone. I'm seeing your comments coming in the chat. Thanks for understanding. Some pieces related to specifically women's experiences in substance use. And of course, people of all gender and gender identities experience DVSA, unfortunately. It's the unfortunate reality. But we also know that substance use tends to impact women, and this is a trans-inclusive women, any feminine identified people, in quite different ways than it tends to impact people who are masculine identified. And so, you know, introduction to substances, women are much more likely to be introduced to substances by an intimate partner versus peers for men. The risk factors for substance use disorder for women are more typically related to experiences of childhood physical or sexual abuse, domestic violence in the childhood home, or needing to take on adult responsibilities during childhood, as well as experiences of DVSA. The negative effects of substance use. Women will use smaller amounts of substances for smaller amounts of time and much more quickly develop substance use disorders and have all kinds of physical health impacts, mental health impacts, as well as impacts in their social network and social functioning. And so this is actually something called the telescoping effect. There's a lot of evidence around it. And so one example of the telescoping effect is that women tend to experience much higher rates of mental health conditions along with their substance use disorders. But because substance use treatment is traditionally built on the needs of men, a lot of substance use treatment providers aren't equipped to provide mental health services in an integrated fashion with substance use services. And so women then have reduced access to resources while also usually having more often having children in their care. So kind of higher resource needs and lower access to resources. There's also evidence that points to women with substance use disorders having less income than men with substance use disorders. So again, here we're seeing high barrier, low resource. And so in this way, women's recovery needs are more multifaceted and often require more comprehensive and holistic approaches that support women and their families, including mental and physical health care, children and family services, as well as tangible resources to address these resource barriers, including vocational support and more. Not to mention the fact that women are more likely to have children in their care and then are more likely to have system involvement from child welfare. And so all the needs in navigating all these different systems. And then how all of these factors and all of these vulnerabilities and all of these systems are so easily weaponized as a tactic of abuse by people who are seeking to use violence and control against their partners. So I knew I'd run out of time. We're already 53 minutes past the hour. So I'm gonna go like hyper speed now so that we can be sure to get to some questions. So, voluntary services and substance use disorder treatment. What's amazing is that a lot of times when we think, okay, but if we just kind of go to an approach where people aren't required to stop using substances or they aren't required to participate in substance use disorder treatment services, then isn't everyone just is it gonna be kind of like a no rules, everyone's just using substances now? And actually the evidence is quite the contrary. That looking at 2-year outcomes, it was found that people were more likely to go to treatment when they weren't being forced to, and they didn't use more substances. And so think about that decisions that go into using substances are really complex, and that it's not about permission to use substances. That isn't why people do or don't use substances when it comes to people in our different programs. And then also, this is 12-month data, that housing can be healing. So specifically in stabilizing housing. So people were more likely to remain stably housed and stop using opioids and stimulants such as cocaine and methamphetamine when programs used person-centered and non-judgmental approaches. They individualized services to a person's self-identified needs and goals and did not require enrollment in substance use disorder treatment. When services were available that provided information and resources on how to mitigate the adverse consequences of substance use, so namely harm reduction, and that services actively engaged people and fostered open communication about substance use. And so here we're really looking at, can we provide, are adequate support services being provided? Engagement in services is not demanded, and it's not a condition of any kind of shelter-based service. And that rather than it being kind of a survivor's responsibility to engage in services, it's staff's responsibility to actively engage people and provide services that are tailored to their self-defined needs and goals. So here are some potential conversation starters. If it's safe in our programs for people to openly discuss substance use, here are just some ways that we can help open conversation. Another approach is also just an intake to let folks know that we have different kinds of resources and supports available for people who use substances and would like to just have a non-judgmental space to talk about that with someone. And then just kind of leaving that door open and letting people bring it up with us when and if they feel like we could help them with that. And so another way when it comes to substance use of really figuring out like, okay, well, if I'm not just going for trying to get people off drugs, what do I do, right? And this is where the stage of change model can be really helpful. We don't apply at the center, we don't apply the stages of change model to people's relationships, to their intimate partner relationships. We do apply it to people's experience of substance use. And so this is especially important whenever we're finding that the kind of support that we're trying to offer isn't quite landing, isn't quite feeling relevant for the person that we're seeking to support. And it's really important to take a step back and reflect on, okay, where are they at in their change process? And how can I do a better job of meeting them where they are? And so I'm totally just going to flip through this really quickly. And so just going to flip through this super quickly and you'll have the slides. But when people are in pre-contemplation, it's really helpful here just to focus on relationship and engagement and helping them with resources and anything that they define as their needs, right? And we're really good at this. We're really experienced at advocating for folks and partnering with folks to support their physical, emotional, and financial safety. I want to point out this resource. This is kfx.org.uk, and they have all these different images and PDFs on different ideas for how to reduce risks and harms related to different substances. So if you're someone who hasn't kind of had a whole lot of exposure to the different substances and what some harm reduction strategies might be, this can be a really great resource. In contemplation, we want to just gently kind of be curious with the person as well as support their skill building. And this can be, it can be really kind of enticing. Like when people start thinking about change, a lot of times we want to like jump to that point and be like, okay, let's make an appointment, or okay, what are you going to do? And then people kind of get freaked out and go, whoa, whoa, too fast, and then go back into pre-contemplation. So here, it's really important to remain neutral, and if anything, weigh in on the side of no change. I'm sorry, I just have to kind of flip through this. All the different pathways of recovery. So when people are preparing, not just jumping to like, okay, now it's time to go to treatment. No, there's a lot of different ways that people can approach the work of recovery or the work of healing. And I have like 1 minute. So I'm actually just gonna open it up now to any questions that have come up as I flip through the slides. I'm so sorry that didn't get through to these kind of last pieces.
Gabriela, this is Brandy. It looks like that we had a question typed in the box. It says, how do you work with someone who is highly intoxicated or seemingly too under the influence or high to make that session productive if they seem unable to focus or retain any information? Do you attempt to ensure their safety for that time and then set another time to meet with them?
That's a really great question. Thank you. So I'll say this, not all levels of intoxication are created equal, right? And so I've worked with folks that have, openly discussed being under the influence, and they've still been able to get a lot out of our time together. And I've also worked with folks who were sober at the time, and almost because they were sober, they were really, really scattered and all over the place. And it was really hard for us to really focus on things. So one thing to keep in mind, of course, first is safety. Are they safe? Are they, do they look like they are, in a place where potentially some medical support is needed? So always kind of just like safety first. From there, if it's not like a medical support that is needed, then really checking in with them around how could we best use our time together right now. And then if it's safe to provide things written, then that can be helpful. And there were times where I would write on someone's sheet, like your copy, because sometimes people would get back home and then find the papers that the copies I had provided for them, and then they'd mail it back to me thinking like, oh, I have the paperwork that Gabriela did, right? So I'd even write like, this is your copy or your copy on there. Then also, there are times that that doing what I can with the person of what they feel like would be most helpful, and that there's a lot of trust that we can build in those spaces, that even if we might not be able to tick a bunch of stuff off of our to-do list, there's still a lot of that relational connecting where people then kind of learn, I was in a, I was in a less than 100% state, and this person didn't judge me, and this person helped keep me safe, and this person is someone who I can trust with this part of myself. And then checking in with people, is there a certain time of day or a certain point that is a better time for us to meet? For some folks, morning appointments are better because they may become more intoxicated as the day goes on. For other folks, actually withdrawal is worse in the morning and something kind of later in the day is better. And then also looking at, there have been times where someone has appeared very, very intoxicated, and it was actually because they were in crisis from having just experienced sexual assault. That, so keeping in mind too, that even if somebody says, I'm really drunk right now, being able to take a step back and look at, okay, why are they this intoxicated right now versus other times where they've been less intoxicated? What's going on in their life, and what are the threats to their safety where this has kind of happened? Because some of the times that I've worked with folks that they've been like the most intoxicated, it's because they had literally just been sexually assaulted like the day before, and this was the best way that they were coping with it. And that just rescheduling them would have really completely missed the crisis that they were in and weren't able to just kind of name at the beginning of the session. And then having food on hand can be really helpful. Offering food, because because that can also help with any of the kind of side effects of unwanted side effects of intoxication. And I'm sure there are so many more questions, and we're over time, so I don't want to take away time from anyone. I do have a few more minutes if folks are able to stay on. I'm happy to keep answering questions.
Gabriela, feel free that if you again, want to respect your time, because this is a wonderful presentation, if folks do want to stay on the line for maybe 5 more minutes or so, looks like there's a couple questions in the box, the chat box, as well as maybe another one here in the Q&A too. Yeah, one question was, can we reach out to you if we have specific questions? So that might be a quicker one to answer.
Absolutely,
yeah.
and let me put up my email address so folks are sure to write that down. And that's also for folks who maybe don't have access to the slides. Well, actually, you will have access to the slides in your email. So if you can't see them now for any reason, one of the final slides has my contact info on it.
Yes, and those should probably be coming out in the next day or so, probably by today's Tuesday, so Wednesday or Thursday. Hard to tell what day it is these days.
Yeah. So I see here a question, a really important question around how do you balance working with survivors who use substances and working with survivors who do not and are triggered by their use or feel unsafe due to their use. So that's the first part of the question. And the second part of the question is along with having children around in a DV shelter environment. So I'll kind of divide those questions up, if that's okay. So one thing that's important is that is to consider that regardless of our stance on substance use is happening in our programs. It's just whether it's talked about or it's not talked about, right? That people in programs where substance use is not, where abstinence isn't required, don't necessarily have higher rates of substance use. So that's one thing to kind of just hold. Another piece is, and I did have congregate living programs where some people were using substances and some people were not. And some people who were using substances were using them without problems, and some people did experience problems. And some people who were not using substances were people who identified as being in recovery, and so feeling triggered by use. So one thing that's really important is just really offering support for folks. So for folks that are feeling triggered, what kinds of support would feel helpful for them to be able to deal with the fact that they're feeling triggered? And so there's so many things that could trigger someone's cravings for substance use, right? And so while seeing somebody else who may appear intoxicated can trigger the desire for the craving experience, there's also so many other things that can trigger a craving experience, like feeling sad or feeling alone, right? Feeling lonely. And so really helping to build our toolbox for how we can offer support to folks who are experiencing cravings. Because whether or not someone is using in our program, it's very likely that people in our program will still experience some kind of substance use craving at one point or another. I remember working with a survivor who she had people kind of on either side of her who were using substances, and she came to us and was very upset by this and felt a lot of distress around feeling cravings to use. And I was so glad that she came to us and talked with us about it, because then that offered us a chance to offer support, right? And so we were able to set up some kind of like individual kind of ongoing sessions with her and check-ins. We were able to help her think about, okay, when you have experienced cravings in the past, what's been helpful? Who might you reach out to? And she ended up reaching out to, she was involved in 12-step programming, and she ended up reaching out to her sponsor by phone and explained, you know, my neighbor is using substances and invited me to use with her, and I feel like I have to leave. I feel like I'm having cravings, you know, I feel like it's really dangerous for my recovery. And she shared with us that her sponsor actually said, she was in recovery from crystal meth, and her sponsor was in recovery from alcohol. And she shared with us that her sponsor shared with her, you know, I have to walk by liquor stores every day on my way to work. And so, you know, building your recovery isn't about hiding from all the things that are triggers. It's about how do you cope and still live your life in the way that you want to live it. And so that, you know, I mean, I could have sat there and said this to the survivor, but that wouldn't have been as helpful, I think, as it was when she heard it from her sponsor, someone who she trusts with that part of her recovery, and someone who has literally been in her shoes in that way. And so looking at how can we leverage peer supports, how can we help the person connect with what are sources of support and recovery-oriented support when they're feeling cravings or triggered. And then the same thing, or very similar thing, for folks who are feeling unsafe. So what are some things that help them feel more safe? What are some things that signal danger to them, and why is that? So how can we understand what's coming up for them? And then what, you know, let's brainstorm what they can do in those moments. And then I've also found it really helpful to facilitate some conversations throughout different, either one-on-one conversations or through community meetings in shelters and transitional kind of congregate living environments. I remember working with one survivor who was in recovery, and she was also feeling distressed about some other people in the housing program, it was a congregate transitional housing program, about their use, and all parties agreed to just talking together with me present. And so I was able to just facilitate some conversation between them and able to talk through so that they could connect on that person-to-person level. And the survivor who was feeling really triggered and unsafe by her neighbor's use actually was able to start seeing her neighbor as just another person, as another survivor who's doing the best she can. And that she actually was interesting. She actually came to a place where in one of our follow-up conversations, she was able to say, you know, everyone deserves safe housing, and I'm really happy that people who use drugs can be here and be safe, and I really wish I would have had that when I was out there. So I realize that all of this can sound really hard, especially when we're in very short-term kind of safe shelter settings, that we might not have the time to really see that evolution. And so the kind of long and short of it is provide, you know, check in with people, provide the support that they define as being needed, that when they felt this way in other times, what's helped them cope with these feelings, how can staff be more available for them. And I remember talking with a DV shelter in Florida that they actually run like a recovery maintenance group. So anyone who identifies as being in recovery and wanting to maintain that can come to the group for peer support and ongoing support. And they actually shared with me, this was so lovely, they shared with me that the people who were attending the group, the recovery group, started actually reaching out to the people in the shelter who were actively using and started inviting them to the group. And that people, and they had tried to run a group for people who were actively using and no one showed up. But that then through that kind of peer-based support, that they started then attending the recovery group for the people seeking and in recovery. And that they really saw this, you know, the residents blossom really through that peer support. And then children.
Gabriela, sorry to interrupt.
Yes.
No, you're fine. I'm wondering if we can weave in, if this could maybe be the final response, if we could weave in the kind of a second half of the question about kids, because in the Q&A box, there's a similar Similar kind of question about how do you support parents struggling with substance use, given our requirement as mandatory reporters if there's child endangerment, while continuing to support families in harm reduction framework. So I thought maybe they might tie together a little bit, or maybe not, but
Yes.
just wanted to throw that one out there if that would be helpful.
Absolutely. And I also invite anyone who's still on to also put in the chat box any strategies you use around supporting parents who use substances and their children. And so, so there's a lot that goes into this. And I actually used to run a housing program for families that was harm reduction based. And so I know firsthand how much work goes into the piece when there is active substance use and children involved. So I first off want to approach this conversation by saying I do not have all the answers. And so what I offer is not meant to simplify anything or just say like, oh, you do this, it's simple. No, that's not, that's not real. The reality is that this, there are no like one size fit all answers. And a lot of it is partnering to figure out what's going to work in a given situation. And a lot of it is also knowing that we don't always know what's going to work until it's now working. So a lot of kind of like creative solution making and trying things out. So, but I will try to offer some ideas and a framework. So first of all, safety first. So if you are in a situation where a parent is unable to care for their children for any reason, then addressing the safety needs first, whether that means stepping in order to make sure that children are safe, whatever that means, doing what needs to be done in order to ensure the immediate safety for children. So safety first. If that situation has come up, then finding ways to engage the parent as a support and as an ally. That we are approaching this as a parent does not want there to be we're assuming kind of best intentions, that parents want to be able to show up for their kids, parents want to be able to take care of their kids. And so how can we be an ally and a support in supporting parents to be able to take care of their kids? And so this can get tricky, right? And there can certainly be defenses that get engaged, and there can be a lot of, we want to be really careful to engage our collaborative skills and our engagement skills so that we're not devolving to any kind of blaming or shaming or trying to prove to a parent that their substance use is out of control or any of these things, or making assumptions about why they weren't, why that crisis happened, that we really want to partner and come alongside as an ally. And it's easier said than done, right? That there's kind of there's an art to that. And that a lot of that also depends on our being able to build those trusting relationships with folks. Then, there are times where connecting with a social support network, if there is one, if there's a safe social support network, can become really important. And so I've worked with survivors where they were able to, make sure that their kids were, staying with a trusted relative while they use substances. So seeing wherever possible, there are supportive, safe social supports that can really be present for children and can aid in some of the stability for children. There's also, there are different resources for helping support survivors to talk about their substance use with their children. And there's a great resource called the Children of Addiction. and they were the ones that partnered with Sesame Street around the Sesame Street character having a parent who is using substances, and they have different posters available and just different talking guides around how to talk with kids that the substance use isn't your fault. It's not something that you can control. And they just have really great talking points that are age appropriate around it's not your fault, you don't control it, and really helping kids to feel as safe as possible and to feel as connected as possible to their parent. That whenever we can support that parent-child attachment, outcomes for parents and children are better. Outcomes in terms of mental health and substance use improve for both parents and children whenever we can support parent-child attachment. Now, there are times where we may need to make a mandated report, and that's an unfortunate reality. And I say unfortunate because many times it can really complicate the picture for survivors and can be another mechanism of abuse and control that an abuser tries to leverage against the survivor. That's why I say unfortunate. And so here it becomes so important to have active collaborations with child advocates, child and family advocates, and child welfare specialists to help really navigate that system, because that system can feel very confusing for someone who is an outsider to that system. And if needed, to help advocate for survivors within that system. And that'll be much more possible when we have those active collaborations in place. Now, there are times where we may need to potentially even kind of provide reports to child welfare potentially. And so whenever possible, using trauma-informed procedures. So first, from the get-go, trauma-informed reporting includes letting the person know that we need to make a report, inviting them to witness and be a part of that report so they know exactly what is said, helping to explain what the process will likely be like moving from here forward, asking if they want to be kept kind of up to date on any contacts that we receive from child welfare, offering the safety plan because we know that there can be retaliation and increased abuse when child welfare reports are made. And then if we do have to submit any kind of, report or anything in writing to child welfare, then doing that in a transparent manner. So what I used to do is that if I had to write a letter for like a, court appearance, I would write that letter and I would share it with the survivor. And I would say, this is right now, and I would do it well in advance of when it was requested and required. And I would say, okay, when I'm required to write a letter, this is the information right now that I can provide that accurately kind of reflects what's going on. Does this say what you would like it to say? And if there's something that you would like it to say that it doesn't, let's talk about that. And then if what the person wants it to say is something that would not be accurate at this time, then I use that as an opportunity to talk through, okay, what can we do? What kinds of services and resources can we offer? What kind of support can we offer so that when I have to write this letter, I can include what you would like this letter to say and it will be accurate. And so really using it sounds really out of left field when I say this, but it can be an opportunity for deepening engagement in a way that's really different. And I only say that from having experiences doing it. I would never, ever have thought or said that before having had those experiences. But all of that really relies on building those trustworthy relationships that are characterized by caring, by support, by people knowing that, we have their back no matter what, and that we're really here to offer support and not judge them. And it takes time to build that when there's trauma in the mix. It takes time.
Gabriela, thank you so much for doing this webinar and being such an awesome resource. This is such a great subject matter, and it sounds like that there's probably more and more questions. And so I also put my email in the chat box for folks as well, and you'll have that when the information comes out. In addition to the PowerPoint, the recording, the different all of the different resources that Gabriela had mentioned, I kept a little list. So hopefully we'll be able to send all of those out in the next day or two. Just know that you can reach out to Violence Free Colorado for some support around these things. Gabriela has included her email to reach out as well. So, hopefully we can answer questions that come up in the future, and we can also brainstorm if we need more webinar space to talk about this issue as well. So that's always great to give us that feedback too, so we can make more space to have more of these great conversations. And one last thing, and I'll throw in there, is that in May, our next brown bag will be Tuesday, May 12th. And the folks at Colorado Sexual Health Initiative they're going to present on talking with teens about sex. Sorry, I wasn't really choking on that phrase. It was just more choking on some water. Sorry about that. Talking with teens about sex. So exciting, because we work with teens as well, or a lot of programs do, and sometimes we have questions as advocates around what are we allowed to talk to teens about and what are we not. Sometimes there's a lot of questions, so hopefully that'll be a great webinar to look forward to as well. And so thank you so much, Gabriela. This has been wonderful.
Thanks, everyone. And one more thing I'll say is that we do have a guide coming out in the near future of how to support survivors who use substances from a trauma-informed approach. And that'll have a series of webinars that go along with it. So stay tuned. There'll be a lot more.
Wonderful. And we'll make sure that we'll share those out with folks too.
Thanks. Thanks, everyone.
All right.
Stay safe, stay healthy.
Bye. Thanks so much, everyone.